Hello and welcome back to the continuation of intermediate forms, fossil record, and physical evidence of geology. This week, we're going to hopefully finish up the fossils and get into what might actually be a even stronger case for creation, and that is the physical evidence of the geologic column. Now, I wanted to point something out that I think I forgot to mention last episode, which is that a lot of people will look at this kind of variation, for example, in dogs, and claim that this is some kind of evolution. We'll study this in more detail when we get to genetics, but I want to point out that each of these kinds of dogs, breeds of dogs, actually has less genetic information than the wolf that it came from, not more. You are simply taking genes that were already present in the gene pool and saying, look, I only want these ones. Border collies, maybe, or German shepherds. I only want the most intelligent genes out of the gene pool, and you're sacrificing some other genetic information. For Chihuahuas, you're selecting a lot of genetic information and throwing it out. So I guess that's my point, is this is not adding new traits or, improving these dogs. You're simply specializing them to a particular task and selecting for a specific set of genetic information. Okay. Again, fossils can be interpreted lots of different ways. There's some people who are still talking about Archaeopteryx as if it's some kind of a big deal. Whereas folks like me are like, okay, next, you want to come back when you have a real argument. The biological difficulties are something to consider as well. Just pretending like finding a range of skeletons and assembling them from largest to smallest is going to solve your problem, is displaying an ignorance of genetics and how organisms actually develop physical characteristics, of course, from their genetic information, okay? Not to mention, many of the transitional forms would be extraordinarily problematic, the difficulties there. We're gonna look at a couple of examples real quick, and that I think we already mentioned, one of them being that a difficulty in getting from a reptile lung over here to a bird lung is that you have to evolve a hole in your lungs in order to get air through them. The gray here is the actual bird lungs, and then the different colors, the red, purple, orange, yellow, and blue are air sacs. So you have all these holes in the bird's lung, which are leading to these air sacs. And if you are trying to evolve them, this is very problematic, because the first thing you have to evolve is a hole in your lung, which probably means you're not going to survive very long. Okay, certainly not going to be an advantage. Many other examples we could look at here. Woodpeckers, for example, have an extreme amount of adaptation in order to do the things that they do. Banging your head on a tree is a really good recipe for a headache. Why is it cause a headache? Well, because your brain, of course, is cushioned with cerebrospinal fluid. And if you whack your head against something really hard, your brain will get crushed up against your skull, and this will cause brain damage. The brain damage will be extremely minor if you just, whack it a little bit. But as it gets more and more severe, you start really killing your brain cells, and this causes an extreme amount of pain, because brain cells dying is about the most pain you can survive. Pretty close to it for the amount of damage that you're doing, right? So trying to evolve a woodpecker that has all the special cushions it does in its head in order to be able to whack its head against the tree. It has special stabilizing feathers in its tail in order to provide more anchors, especially strong claws, a tongue which wraps around the back of its skull, because again, its whole point here is to find insects. So once it gets through the bark, it has to have a tongue long enough to actually find these insects and eat them. And if it doesn't, then it's going to go hungry. So it certainly seems like that whole system was designed from the start possibly an example of irreducible complexity. Again, the concept we'll talk more about in genetics. Giraffes, very similar kind of thing. You have to have they're the tallest animals in the world, right? They have to have a very strong heart to pump blood all the way to the top of their head. Well, and then of course their legs are like 6 or 8 feet long. So when they bend their head down to get a drink, all that blood rushing up to their head would actually cause it to explode from the gravity combined with their blood pressure. So they have a special system of valves and checks and spongy tissues in their neck, which are specially designed to absorb that blood and keep it from all rushing to their head at once and causing an aneurysm. Okay. So again, you can't have a long neck without all that stuff. So it's not just the long neck you have to evolve. You have to have the special tissues in your neck. You have to have those valves. You have to have a stronger heart. You have to have all these things in order for any of it to work. Bombardier beetles are perhaps one of the best examples that we could look at, having 2 chemicals in their butts, their abdomens, which I believe are hydroxyquinone and hydrogen peroxide. When mixed together, of course, they are violently exothermic, which is the chemist's way of saying it explodes and it reaches temperatures in excess of 200 degrees. And the bombardier beetle uses it to spray on bad guys. Well, the thing is, you have to mix them together in a chamber to get them all mixed together. You want this reaction to happen quickly once it's spurted out of you. And so the chemicals need to be thoroughly mixed in order to get the best rate of reaction. However, if that happened inside the beetle's butt, it would just blow its butt off. So it has a chemical inhibitor that it mixes in with the chemicals to make sure that it doesn't blow its butt off until right before it shoots this stuff at Mr. Bad Guy, and then it adds an inhibitor that inhibits the inhibitor. And that's when the reaction takes place. So obviously, to me, a system which was designed from the beginning to meet the needs of this particular beetle. We're going to talk more about this in genetics. Stay tuned. Now, are there humans? We find fossils of apes. We saw lots of examples of pretty good ape fossils with Australopithecines in the last session. Okay. But are there human fossils in the fossil record? Good question. The answer is yes, the short answer, and the long answer, of course, is quite a bit more interesting. You find a lot of, well, almost myth-like things, okay? Bigfoot-like stories, usually a lay person that finds these things, and stuff that's posted online with very little actual evidence. I don't want to get too far off into the weeds here. I have some links if you'd like to go and do some more research yourself. It is very possible that these giants are actually Nephilim. We see, for example, I have a link here. I think it's the first one, yeah, that talks about a Native American legend, if you want to call it that, oral tradition, which said something along the line, I'm going to paraphrase here, but feel free to go and read it yourself, that they did not come to a land that was uninhabited when the Native Americans got here. The First Nations are not actually the First Nations. They met, well, giants when they got to America. These giants were very interesting. First of all, there weren't that many of them. Second of all, they weren't all that big. Very similar to the accounts we have in the scripture of the giant Goliath being about 8 or 9 or 10 feet tall. Is the reported height of these guys. A lot of them have red hair. We have legends in other places of the world of giants who are cyclopses or even had 2 heads. And while some of that is probably artistic license that may have been added to the story, it's not out of the question that these giants have some kind of a genetic mutation, if you will, Okay. And maybe this is where some humans got the idea that anybody born with red hair had a demon inside of them and you couldn't let them live. That, again, was not that common in ancient cultures, but it did exist. Where did they get that idea from? Good question. Well, we have an account, not in Genesis, but in apocryphal texts, such as the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilee, and the book of Jasher, about the Nephilim. Now, one of the major reasons why those books were not included in the Bible as canon was their descriptions of these giants, these Nephilim, that roamed the earth before Noah's flood. I believe it's the book of Enoch that gives the height of these giants as somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 feet. And so the folks that were putting together our Bible, which I think happened in the Council of Nicaea or something like that. I haven't studied church history in a while, but several hundred years after the death of Christ, right? When they were reading about this stuff, they were like, yeah, that's a bunch of fairy tales nonsense. Kind of sounds like the old myths from the Norse mythology, though, doesn't it? Norse mythology had their hero, Thor, defeating giants. How big were these giants? Enormous, the size of mountains. These were the Titans, right? Very interesting to note that Titans in Greek mythology were the offspring of the gods and humans. That first generation were so powerful that Zeus locked them up and didn't let them out. And if they ever got out, it was going to be bad for the earth. Very interesting, because in the account of I think it's the book of Enoch, correct me if I'm wrong, a very similar picture is painted of these humongous Nephilim, that they were so powerful that God wiped them out. Maybe that's why the flood came, that God had to do this damage to our planet in order to make sure that the Nephilim did not have an environment where they could come back. 21% oxygen concentration, for example, would prevent these large giants from growing. And a lot of the giants that used to roam our planet, like the dinosaurs and the 50-foot long crocodiles and the 20-foot tall ground sloths and the 275-pound beaver, and a lot of those might have suffered the same fate, that the damage done to the earth prohibited them from growing. Well, let's think about this. Is this really physically possible to get a human that's 300 foot tall? Not today, it's not. But we are aware of humans that have genetic mutations that keep your growth plates from sealing over, right? You've probably been through a growth spurt, okay? Once you go through your last growth spurt, which happens somewhere as a young adult, somewhere between 12 and 18 years old for most humans, although some men keep growing into their early 20s, after which we just grow sideways, right? When that happens and you end your growth spurt, there's a plate that grows over, it calcifies that growth plate in your bones, and you stop growing. You don't grow after a certain time period in your life. But there are genetic mutations that prevent this from happening. It's called gigantism. Now, not all giants are giants of humans, people 7-8 feet tall. Not all those people have this mutation, but some of them do. Okay, so feel free to research this. But yeah, some of the tallest humans ever recorded, we have figured out, had this mutation. Their growth plates never seal over and they never stop growing. Now, they slow down an awful lot when they start having problems, circulating blood and, those kinds of things. They start growing themselves to death almost. But imagine if they were in a different environment. Imagine if they lived in a 35% oxygen concentration at twice atmospheric pressure. Imagine what might happen then if the Nephilim are products of demons mating with humans, raping humans basically, then perhaps that union of that DNA cause these kinds of mutations. Maybe that's why giants have red hair. Maybe because it's a mutation, right? Now it's not going to hurt you today. Lots of people have red hair today, but it's a mutation, right? So we saw that immediately. The first generation that had these kinds of weird genetics compared to a typical human being. Well, these became so numerous on the earth, they became extraordinarily violent and perhaps wiped out much of the humans that lived before the flood. It's very possible that human population actually wasn't that big, and then the sin on the earth was caused mainly by these Nephilim. It is perfectly possible that Noah was chosen because of his genetics. He was bound to be pure in the eyes of God, right? I think that's interesting. And of course, Noah could have been significantly larger than we are today, but not a Nephilim, right? And the Bible says that Nephilim were on the earth in those days. But feel free to go and read this. I encourage you to read it. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Well, is that kind of a weird little footnote there? It's very possible that Genesis, of course, was written from notes that Noah took. Okay. All right. If that's true, then when Noah gets off the ark and he says everything's been wiped out, I mean the whole earth. Well, yeah, but we know that there were still living things on the earth. Well, the bacteria didn't all die. The fish didn't all die during Noah's flood. Noah is describing the environment that he encounters when he gets off of the ark. It's bleak. It's devastation. There's nothing. We gotta start over, basically. Okay. So it's quite possible that as humans start reestablishing themselves and they spread out, that they encounter Nephilim that survived Noah's flood. Well, how are you going to survive a sudden catastrophe like that with no planning? Well, perhaps they had ships, or perhaps they were able to cling to mats of vegetation. Wouldn't have been many of them that survived. Certainly all the really large ones died because the atmosphere changed so much they couldn't breathe. But the smaller ones, the ones 8, 9, 10, 12 foot tall, might have been able to survive in small numbers. And what do we read from the ancient sources about giants? All of them are bad. All of them are cannibals. All of them are not just bad, they're evil. They worship demons or Satan or whatever. You can't negotiate with them. You can't trade with them. They're, and you can imagine if you ran into one of these things and it ate your uncle, you're not going to be negotiating with this thing. Well, of course, humans ganged up on them and defeated the giants of old, right? There's not any more left. But many of these fossils that we find are extraordinarily large. There's an example for just one example of a femur that was found in an Egyptian tar pits. That's about 4 foot long. That guy would have been 12 feet tall, would have worn a size 40 shoe. So very large individual, possibly demonic. And also, by the way, that is possibly why God told the children of Israel to wipe out the Canaanites, because for some reason, perhaps they had not been successful in defeating the giants that were there when they got there, but instead intermarried with them, probably not of their own choice. But yeah, for whatever reason, those Nephilim decided to join forces with the humans after they spread out from where they landed in Mount Ararat. And yeah, there's a land of giants. When the children of Israel go to spy out the land and they're like, look, we're like grasshoppers to these guys. That's probably an exaggeration, but It's not out of the question. They could have been staring at giants 12 foot tall. And if you're a human at that time, you know, average adult height, 5'2", 5'4", maybe 5'5", that's a pretty stinking huge advantage for a warrior at that time to have. And certainly Goliath had that kind of an advantage. And of course, David took very seriously, the King David, not me, took very seriously the extermination of these giants. He wasn't called the giant slayer for nothing. He pulled 5 smooth stones out of the river before he slew Goliath. What does he think he's going to miss 4 times? No. Goliath had 4 brothers. David killed them all. Okay, he was zealous for this. So it's very interesting that people at that time that followed God was like, I need you to do something for me. I need you to wipe out the giants, and I'll help you. Okay. So, by the way, I have a friend who's much smarter than me. Okay. If you're interested in meeting him, he's an extraordinary individual. He actually believes this is why the Library of Alexandria was burned down, that it wasn't necessarily some kind of freak accident, but that God intentionally destroyed those records because they included some of the burial sites for the Nephilim. And if humans were able to access that burial site today, they could possibly harvest some of that DNA. And that would be an extraordinarily bad thing for humans to be messing around with. A lot of these skeletons of giants that have been recorded in the YouTube video, you can watch if you want. A lot of those skeletons were accidentally / possibly on purpose destroyed in World War II. Okay, so I think all this is very interesting, but it's not especially related to origins. Okay, I want to look at 1 or possibly 2 good examples, though, of actual human fossils found in the fossil record. One being human footprints that have been found alongside dinosaur tracks and sometimes inside of dinosaur tracks at Glen Rose, and the other being Malachite man. Okay. The Answers in Genesis article here is very good if you are curious about this. Dr. Don Patton, same guy from the movie last week, also has a video out on the extensive research, photography, and all that he's been able to do down at Glen Rose, along with many other young earth creationists who are absolutely convinced that those are human footprints that we find alongside obvious dinosaur tracks that are there. So I'll let you study up on that one. I want to show you what I think is one of the most interesting fossils in the world, which is Malachite man. If I can find a good picture. Here we go. Now, malachite is an ore of copper. Okay, it's about 30% copper, and in some places of the world, like in this one is in, I want to say South Dakota, northern South Dakota or southern North Dakota, one of the two. In this situation, we see human bones that have malachite deposits inside them. They've been mineralized. Okay. So they're fossils, unquestionably human, about the same size as us. And this particular one, this is Dr. Don Patton that's holding it. He actually has some of these in his lab. This particular one does not have a high degree of mineral replacement, but you can see the malachite there. And I was hoping to find another one. Yeah, here we go. This is what I'm looking for. This bone hopefully you can see that. Let me make sure I have a good share on this. Yeah. So if you Google malachite man jaw, you'll get to this page and you can see the incredible degree of mineral replacement that we see on this human femur. All right. And here's a couple of photos of a jaw that has been recovered from the site. By the way, this was officially reported in National Geographic when it was originally discovered back in the 60s, okay, 1960s. They said it was an Indian Native American burial ground and that, nothing to see here. Later on, more excavations turned up. I think the original excavation was 2 skeletons, and later excavations have revealed a total of 10. However, this is not a burial ground, okay? First of all, these skeletons were found in situ, S-I-T-U. In other words, they are buried in rock. Now, it's not stupid hard rock. You can dig through it with a pocket knife, but it is, we call it semi-ossified, I think is the word. Semi-lithified rock. So it's not extremely hard rock, but it would have been very difficult to dig through hundreds of feet of this rock to get to where they are found. I think there's a diagram somewhere here that shows how deep they were buried. I believe they were buried about 50 foot down. Okay, so you can see this one from the side. So this whole cliff side here is something like 100 feet tall. You can see the shrubbery on the side. There's some trees in the background. Give you a rough idea of the scale of the photo. This, if I'm not mistaken, this is the pit where the excavation was going on, where these guys were recovered from. So it's about 50 foot down from the surface. And most importantly, it's covered over by a layer of extraordinarily hard rock, a type of shale, which was so impervious that initial mining efforts at the site, it's a very good copper mine, initial mining efforts were suspended because they couldn't get through that layer of rock with bulldozers and things like that. So it's tearing up their bulldozer blades, and they actually quit mining there for quite a while because of that problem. Copper prices went up, and decades later they returned. But you understand where I'm going with this. Native Americans would not have been able to dig. First of all, digging down 50 feet and getting through that dozens of feet thick layer of extraordinarily hard rock with hand tools, it's just out of the question. The softer rock that they're found in, yes, they probably could have gotten through that. But again, that would be hundreds of feet from a road cut, which only exposed this area in the 50s, right? So I want to emphasize that. We see as further evidence that these bones were buried with the rock. You see this dark staining of the rock surrounding these bones. This is evidence, again, that they were all buried together. This is one of the only, so here's the femur, we see the leg bone and the ankle down here. This is one of the only ones that is found articulated. Most of the bones are not articulated. Okay, so they went through some kind of extreme trauma and they got torn up. And for example, these two bones here, you might think they go together. Anatomically, they don't. They just got buried there in a pile. All right. So you might say, well, it was a mining accident, it was a cave, and maybe the ancient peoples of America were more advanced than we thought, and this is a mining cave-in. No, absolutely out of the question. First of all, the bones are definitely very old. We do not find any proteins associated with the burial. So it's only mineral. I want to say the protein is collagen. It's not collagen, is it? I think it is. Anyway, whatever protein that strengthens your bones, you can actually test. After about 1,000 years, collagen decays away completely, depending on the environment that it's buried in, of course. And there's no collagen in these, no protein at all. So they are significantly older than that, than Native Americans probably would have buried them here. They are way too deep. to be a burial. They are not in sit, or they are in situ. They are not articulated, most of the skeletons. If you're trying to argue that this is a mining cave-in, there are at least 2 women that are buried here. Women do not mine things. Okay, no offense to the ladies out there, but mining, especially in ancient times, was an extraordinarily risky, dangerous thing to do. It's wet, it's hot. If you get really deep down in there, it's stagnant and stifling. You're doing it by candlelight or lantern light. Cave-ins are very common. Suffocation is very common. It is brutally difficult labor, swinging a hammer that long. Women just don't mine things. Okay, it might offend some people, but 99%, over 99% of coal miners are men. Mining industry is dominated by men. So it turns out most of the people that are really pushing for women's lib and all this stuff, oh, it's a patriarchy. Like, why don't we see women garbage collectors? They can be a garbage collector. Why don't they want to be? Those are good paying jobs. You can make a lot of money running a garbage truck. Why don't we see women mining? Why is it only the air conditioned, climate controlled skyscrapers that they want those jobs? If we're going to play fair, then 50% of all miners should be women. Is that fair? 50% of all bricklayers should be women. Do you have any idea how difficult of a job that is to burn through 5,000-6,000 calories a day in 120 degrees, wearing all that protective equipment? You think that's easy? Try it sometime. We don't find women in mines historically or today. So I think that's out of the question. We also find at least 1 child. So we find no tools that they would have needed to do the mining work. And need I remind you that they are actually buried in the rock, there's no crumbled rock. I know you can see crumbled rock in the picture, but if you go to the site today and you're digging through all of this, you can tell that this is actual solid rock that these bones were removed from. Now, the reason why these are such a big deal, of course, is that they are found in rock that's supposed to be 120 million years old. This is the same rock that the humongous T-Rex skeleton was found in. This is the same rock layer as Dinosaur National Park in North Dakota. I think this is probably some of the best evidence that exists for humans walking with dinosaurs, and apparently some of them were running around during Noah's flood, and these particular folks, didn't make it. By the way, sometimes you'll hear these skeletons called Moab Man, but that's not really appropriate. This is very high grade malachite, almost jewelry grade turquoise, right? So I wanted to bring this up to you. Most Christians have never heard of Malachite Man, and of course, it's right next to or in the same rock layer as Dinosaur National Monument in all of the humongous fossils that we find of T-Rex and other dinosaurs in that area. Okay. Let me make sure I got a good share here. I do. Awesome. Okay, so we have very good evidence that humans and dinosaurs lived together. And we do have some evidence of humans in the fossil record. Another example, I think we talked about all of this. Yes. Another example of a human artifact is a Cretaceous hammer. I'm not going to take the time to click on this link, but there's also a small bell that they found in a lump of coal. These kinds of finds are not known to mainstream science. They sort of discount it if they do know about it. It is true that the hammer was not found in situ. It was encased in a rock, but it had fallen down from a cliff, we know not where. The general age of the rock in that area is Cretaceous, which again is about 120 million years old, according to the evolutionists. And it's a very excellent hammer. It's kind of an interesting, I don't know how to describe it, like chemical composition. That's the word I'm looking for the hammer. It has sulfur in it, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, really weird chemical composition there. So a type of steel that's not modern. Is not modern. We don't make steel like that. So, and here's a link I was talking to. I hope that works. I haven't tested it recently. About Glen Rose dinosaur and human tracks. It's about an hour. We might take the time to watch that later on. Now, as promised, we've gotten through the fossil record. Fossil record is pretty hard on the evolutionary worldview. Certainly, I think any reasonable person, not all humans are reasonable, would have to agree that the fossil record is not the ironclad evidence for evolution that possibly you were taught in school, okay? And if you doubt me, then I just have to ask you the question, why then are there so many experts in paleontology who are believing in hopeful monsters? Why do they believe in punctuated equilibrium if the fossil evidence is so convincing? They're experts in paleontology and they say it's so unconvincing that they think evolution happened in a totally different mechanism. They know not how. All they know is there are huge gaps in the fossil record, no intermediate forms to speak of in many of those cases, okay? However, I think the physical evidence is the most damaging that there is. And it's everywhere. It's inescapable. Many places of the world do not have excellent fossil remains. But most places on this planet have pretty dadgum extensive sedimentary rock. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. You're sitting in Oklahoma on somewhere between 1 and 2 miles worth of sedimentary rock in our area of the world. Something like 70% of the land is covered with sedimentary rock. Isn't that weird? We don't find much sedimentary rock down at the bottom of the ocean where you would expect sedimentary rock to form if this planet really has, in fact, been here for millions and billions of years. So evolutionists used to teach, they don't anymore. I know they used to teach, you probably think they still do, that layers of rock form slowly over millions of years, and that fossils found within those layers also form over vast periods of time. Science has not been kind to those ideas. But first, a word from our sponsor. We need to remind ourselves that there are 2 pillars of evolution supporting Charlie Darwin's crazy idea. One was the geologic column. The other being homology, that organisms are very similar to each other. So we're going to look at the geologic column and see if it actually is a pillar of evolution or whether this is just another shot in the foot for the philosophy of evolution. The fact that life forms in various layers of rock are very different from one another was one of 2 reasons that Darwin said, okay, I can see small changes in sheep today, so we can extrapolate that back through time and get an origin of every species. That's the greatest extrapolation of data that has ever happened by anybody who claimed to be reasonable. Okay. So Darwin extrapolated what he saw with the finches, small changes in the finch beaks over eons of time to get macroevolution. In other words, small changes plus time equal big changes. That was his rationale. And his reason for justifying that kind of a leap was the fact that different layers of strata have very different organisms in them, typically, okay? So if you went to a government school, you've seen this chart, okay? You start down here in the Precambrian layer. Precambrian rock has basically no fossils, a handful of bacteria, the occasional worm, not much to speak of. You get into the Cambrian layer, you find trilobites. Trilobites were basically all dead by the second or third layer here. You don't find them higher than that. You start to find complicated shellfish, some crustaceans. Higher up in that, you find bony fishes and plated fishes. We only find plated fishes in one of these layers. And then above that, you find some fossil ferns and the occasional amphibian, and then finally reptiles, leading to the big reptiles, leading to the biggest reptiles, and then finally mammals on top of that. Although mammal fossils are pretty rare, and human fossils almost non-existent compared to the bajillions of fossils of clams that we have everywhere. So the idea is that these kinds of things form slowly over millions of years, and so that they represent vast periods of time. However, they could be interpreted a different way. You might look at this chart and be like, actually, doesn't it make just as much sense, maybe more sense, that we're looking at the bottom of the ocean, and then we look at deep water ocean, then we look at shoreline ocean creatures. Most of the big fishes are in here. Most of the bony fishes are in this layer. And then we find occasional amphibians and ferns, just, the stuff you would see at the edge of the ocean, right there next to the ocean, with, swampy type stuff, basically. And then as you get further and further away, you find larger and larger animals that have higher metabolisms and have more and more independence from the water. They don't have to go live by the water for their body temperature regulation. And then, of course, the mammals are going to be able to live the farthest away from the water. In other words, it might be perfectly reasonable to argue that the geologic column is not evidence of when an organism lived and died, but where an organism lived and died. That is my opinion. That is just my opinion, okay? The first thing you need to know about this fancy schmancy chart is it doesn't exist, not in its continuous unbroken form. We find bits and pieces of it all over the place, and so it's been put together layer by layer by geologists. You find these layers over here, and you find those layers over there, and you sort of figure out what the complete geologic column might look like. It is true that we do find different layers and that they generally occur in a specific order, but the Grand Canyon, for example, only has 4.5 out of the 13 different layers, and only parts of those 4.5 layers. We remind ourselves the chart we saw was put together by biologists. We're not experts in paleontology. The fossils we see oftentimes tell a total different story. They haven't updated their chart to reflect reality. In other words, if you go out to the fossil record today, most of what you're going to find is clams, and more clams. Okay, you're not going to find many vertebrates anywhere in the fossil record. Of course, Darwin said, hey, the gaps are going to get filled in. Well, let's have a look here. So initially, our studies of the Cambrian layer led us to believe that these organisms were rather primitive and that they, evolved first, right? It's the first layer we find any meaningful fossils in, right? However, now we know that that is not true. The Cambrian layer contains 35 out of 40 animal phyla. Wow. Nearly all fossil creatures, including vertebrates, are found down there in the very bottom layer. This makes a mockery of macroevolution. Most scientists ignore what we call the Cambrian explosion, right? So I'm sure you've seen the evolutionary tree of life. Well, most of it's death, so I'm going to call it the tree of death, if you don't mind. You got your prokaryotic bacteria leading to a eukaryotic bacteria that branches off in all these different ways. You've got the plants over here, and you've got the vertebrates over here, and you have humans way up at the top, along with birds and some dead ends and things like that. you have to modify it all the time because they keep finding out that stuff is related when it's not related or isn't related. They thought it was related, like skunks. It turns out they're not related to the other Mustelidae, so they had to put it in their own order, which I think is Mephitidae. Anyway, this is not what we see in the fossil record. This is what we see in the fossil record. So it's not an evolutionary tree of death. It is a creationist lawn, if you will. Okay. So we look at these phyla, we notice that there's only a handful of them you find in Precambrian rock. A couple of worms, that's about it. Okay. And if you just look through the fossil record, you notice that there are so many that you find in the bottom layers, and then many of them become extinct as time goes on. Sorry to say, but the sauropod dinosaurs are no longer with us. And then finally, you get to the present. In other words, we're not getting bigger, better, faster, stronger, smarter. We are losing our genetic diversity. Approximately 40% of all living things that were originally created on this planet no longer exist. Most of those went extinct as a result of Noah's flood and after effects of Noah's flood. Okay. So the fact that we look at the bottom layer here and we see this explosion of diversity is very difficult to explain if you want to believe that God doesn't exist. Okay, how do we get all of these animal phyla popping up seemingly out of nowhere all at once? Well, that only makes sense if they got buried down there in Noah's flood. And of course, some of the organisms that live higher up might get washed down in there and mixed together. And so you might predict that the bottom layer of the fossil record would actually have the most diversity in it, just because some of the stuff from higher up, that lives on the shoreline may have gotten flooded down there. You're not going to find a ton of those fossils, but you are going to find a few. And those are representatives. For example, we find fossils of pollen and wood down here in the Cambrian layer. Not very many of them, but we do find a few. Okay. Most famously, some by Indian scientists recently doing excavations over there. And so, by the way, that fits perfectly with Hindu. Hindu believes in a cyclical life cycle to the universe. So they trumpeted it as evidence that evolution is not true. We don't have a climb up onwards and upwards, but that we started with a higher diversity than we have today. And I think that's pretty interesting that, it's kind of weird looking at a Hindu and saying, well, there's a fellow that'll help me in my fight against evolution, but that's what they do. So, and so some of them do believe in, I said, possibly many of them do believe in evolution, but not the molecules to humans type of evolution. Right? I believe in a more cyclical. Anyway, I don't want to get too distracted here. I would just like to point out that it's not just Christians that are putting forth these kinds of evidences that, how are you going to explain the Cambrian explosion? Well, they can't explain it, so they ignore it. And not all of them are willing to ignore it, though. We do find intellectually honest evolutionists, particularly the tops of their fields. Okay. Richard Dawkins, who's a very rabid anti-creationist, very secular, very much hates God, not just an atheist, hates God, wrote in 1986, and he's a British guy, so if you don't mind. And we find many of them, that is fossil organisms, already in an advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appear, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Well, that's exactly what we expected to find. Of course, the evidence doesn't convince him because he can't be convinced by the evidence, just like most humans cannot be convinced by evidence. Some of the most advanced creatures that we find are in the bottom layer of the geologic column, in the Cambrian layer. Trilobites, some of the most common fossils in this layer, actually had the most advanced eyesight of any known creature. Okay,
they actually used crystals as lenses. Now, you and I have a gel-like lens, just one of them, that our eyeball uses muscles to focus properly. And it's quite a remarkable design. It can focus near and far very quickly. So if you're using it for hunting or something like that, or it's extraordinarily useful. Or building something and you need to be able to focus on, the brick that you placed in the wall versus all the bricks in the wall. Very useful way to design a human eyeball. These guys don't have that. They have crystals, not the compound eyes that we find in the insects. In fact, a totally different system. The math necessary to understand how a trilobite eye focuses light was not developed until the 1960s, approximately 14 times as complicated as ours. And of course, another example of what has been called parallel evolution, right? So eyesight apparently had to evolve 4 different times. It evolved for the trilobites, it evolved for the insects, it evolved for the vertebrates, and it evolved for the squid, the cephalopods, right? The squids, the octopus, and the cuttlefish that apparently have a totally different system than ours for focusing light. They have a W-shaped pupil, for example, that is excellent at detecting light in ocean conditions, as these eyes are perfectly designed and would give perfect underwater vision in the murky depths of the sea. Okay, and there they are, the most complicated eyeballs in the world, right there in the Cambrian layer. Okay, we got to talk about how fast these layers were deposited. Historically, again, secular scientists have estimated, because of course they didn't see it happen, the rate of deposition in these layers to be somewhere between 1,500 to 2,700 years per strata. Some people saying it takes hundreds of thousands of years to lay down an inch. However, that is not even close to true. I'm going to give you several examples. Absolute proof, or as close to absolute proof as you can get in the sciences, of a very fast deposition rate. When we get to heaven, I want to rewind. God, if you're listening, I want to see this, okay? I want to rewind to the scientist that discovered these jellyfish. Of course, he was an evolutionist, and he'd been taught it all of his life that fossils form very slowly over thousands of years and all that stuff. And he went out, finally, after completing his doctorate, they let him outside. That was a mistake, because he discovered this huge deposit of jellyfish, dozens of feet in both directions, and 12 or 13 foot thick. And he looked at these jellyfish, which, by the way, are still alive today, even though they're a little bit smaller than they used to be. He looked at these jellyfish and he said, well, this whole deposited layer had to form in less than 24 hours. In fact, pretty close to instantaneous burial had to take place in order to preserve these fossils. Okay. And of course, if there's instant burial, you're looking at more of a snapshot rather than the slow, gradual accumulation that we might have been told about in the textbooks. We find polystratic fossils, just means many layers. I would like to point out this particular fossil. If you Google polystratic fossils, you'll find dozens of examples. One of my favorites, by the way, of a polystratic fossil is a tree whose root ball is in a coal seam. The trunk goes through dozens of layers of sedimentary rock, much like this one. And then the branches of it are in the next coal seam. Not even making this up. That is a real thing. Now, this tree is so well preserved, we can actually see the bark on it. You can see the chip hammer over here for scale. And again, I want to point out that its root actually extends all the way down here to this layer, which is why the picture goes so far down, right? So you've got these layers. Again, this is not just one layer. There's actually several layers here. And then you have multiple layers inside this rock. and then a couple of big layers here, and then smaller ones there, 4, 5, 6, 7. You get your way up here. You got 3 or 4 large ones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers there. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You get the idea. There's 40 or 50 layers that this fossil is protruding through. We just call these polystratic fossils. We don't, we don't tell school children about this kind of thing because that makes a mockery of the idea that these rock layers form slowly over millions of years. Not even close. Okay. Polystratic fossils are very common in some areas. They are the dominant fossil. Coal seams, for example, have perhaps the dominant fossil being trees that go through multiple layers. And in some cases, dozens of layers. You can follow the link here, or just Google polystratic fossil or polystrate fossil. We have other evidences. Now, again, most humans will not be convinced by the evidence. I actually showed this picture to a gentleman I was debating who tried to tell me that fossils form slowly over millions of years. And I was like, look, you're a very intelligent human being. You're smarter than I am. But, and Colin, if you're listening, I still think about you from time to time, buddy. You're a very intelligent human being, Colin, but I'm just here to tell you, no paleontologist believes, no geologist believes what you were taught in school, which is that layers form very slowly over millions of years. Geologists don't believe that anymore, and they haven't believed that in decades. The evidence is just too overwhelming. And I showed him this picture. And I said, look, how long does, he's an expert in biology, of course. How long does it take a fish to eat another fish? A couple of seconds, if that. This guy was fossilized in the middle of lunch. And this guy, this incredibly intelligent human being, much more intelligent than me, looks at me and said, well, it's possible that the small fish was fossilized first and then the big fish was fossilized on top of it with its mouth open. No, that's not possible. You can actually go and look at the skeletal structure, and the large fish actually definitely has his mouth around the small fish. So this guy was buried so quickly, he couldn't even finish lunch, which really ought to freak you out, because that means all this rock was laid down in a hurry. What kind of a flood does it take to lay down several feet of sedimentary rock? We've never seen a flood like that. Maybe Mount St. Helens, but we're talking about a rock layer here that covers most of North America. Mount St. Helens covered a couple of square miles at most. What kind of flood would be necessary to form the kind of sedimentary rock that we observe that we're sitting on? Well, geologists have been forced by the evidence to agree that, there's no evidence that layers were formed slowly over millions of years. In fact, the layers were definitely laid down very quickly. And so they say, of course, that the fossils, or that the time necessary for evolution occurs between the layers. And of course, as Dr. John Patton would say, where there is no evidence. I want to leave you today with one last example. Proof, as close to absolute proof as we can get in the sciences, that fossils were buried quickly. Now, I just Googled fossil clam, okay? And I'd like for you to sort of think about what all these fossil clams have in common. There's one thing that all of them have in common. What would it be? Not that one. That one's been excavated. Okay, so this one doesn't have it in common, but these all do. They're all fossilized in the closed position. Oh, here we have one shell that's not fossilized in the closed position. How long can a clam keep its shell closed for? A couple of hours? We find all these fossils of clams in the closed position, billions of tons of fossil clams out there. At least millions of tons of fossil clams. Some of them were fossilized so quickly they couldn't close. How long does it take a clam to close its shell? Of course, it depends on the species, but most of them can close it in a couple of seconds. What about this guy? What about that guy? This clam was fossilized at 100 miles an hour. What about this guy over here? Fossilized, buried at least, before he could close completely. This is as close to absolute proof as you can get in the sciences that these fossils were formed very rapidly, that they were buried very rapidly. Mineralization may take a while, but the burial happened very quickly. So next week, well, actually next week we may take fall break, but the next session that we get into, we're going to talk about this claim that again, the evidence that these fossils were formed quickly is so overwhelming that all modern paleontologists and geologists agree that fossils were buried very, very fast. There's no question about it. Okay, so if you're debating about that, you're only displaying your abject ignorance about even the most basic fundamental truths of modern paleontology and geology. You don't debate me. Go ask an expert. Okay, they'll all tell you that these fossils, these clams were buried quickly. They had to be buried quickly. Okay, 100 miles an hour type fast, right? Next session, we're going to examine the argument that they have, which is that the time occurs between the major layers, and that will get us to paraconformities, which is my personal favorite. I'll see you then.